So the first thing we're going to talk about are basic policies, and I guess there's a question that preempts that. So, why are we doing any of this today? Why are we having just under an hour to talk about policies in the first place? And the answer to that actually is that over 60%, so 62% of the businesses that Go for Growth is working with, and we are working with thousands of organisations at the moment. 62% of those organisations tell us that getting some support around writing good policy would be helpful. Over a quarter of businesses that we talk to also say they are concerned with compliance to policy in some areas. So what we know is that it can be big, it can be thorny, it can be challenging and complicated. And that's especially so, I think that's polarised if you're a smaller organisation, a micro business, for example, or in the voluntary sector, where what you're doing on policy is just one strand of many, many strands that you're working through, in addition to the core goods or services that you are in a process of selling. And so actually we're going to chat today about what basic policies might look like. So first question to Chris today, if I may, just in your view, what does a good policy look like on a very general basis?
So I think a good policy needs to be proportionate to the organisation who's written it, and it has to be specific to them. So what I mean by that is, if we look at that, the list on the screen at the moment, so health and safety. If you're a micro business and or a sole trader, you might not need a written health and safety policy, but you need to be aware of what your obligations are under various health and safety legislation. Or if we look at GDPR and data protection more broadly, and apologies if all my examples come from either construction, social care or health, which has been my sort of main areas of experience, but if you're a scaffolding firm, you might have some personal details that you're storing, you might have some commercially sensitive information, but your GDPR and data protection policy could be quite straightforward in terms of how you store that, where you store that, how you dispose of it in a certain period of time. But if you contrast that with maybe an SME that's developing apps for use in healthcare, where there's lots of activity going on. Well, if you're storing personal information and you're using that and you're creating stuff with that, your GDPR policy is probably going to be, in your cybersecurity side of it, it's going to be a lot more robust and a lot bigger. So I think for me, proportionality is really important. So it's not a one size fits all. It's what is appropriate for your business, and not to be scared off by, if you see someone who has reams and reams and reams of detail in a policy, that might be appropriate for their business, but it might not be appropriate for yours. So I think that's the main thing to sort of keep an eye on, that policies are important to have a sort of a written record of how we operate and how we do our delivery, do our work, who we are as an organisation. So they need to be proportionate, but they also need to be about you and how you run your business, rather than what I think or what anyone else thinks, really, or just one that you've seen somewhere else. So hopefully that helps.
I think that really helps, actually, that proportionality, and we'll talk a little bit about it as we go along, but in public sector procurement, you're not comparing policy with policy, are you, in the competition phase? So that proportionality and it being that specific to your business, I think is super relevant. It can be quite scary when especially if you are using templates, which we'll also talk about shortly. You could get a template for a GDPR policy that could be 30 pages long, which could be wholly disproportionate to your organisation based on the personal data that you capture. So even some of the help supports that are out there, they can be disproportionate to start with. I do just want to explain some of the acronyms that I've included in here. Most people might know them, but just for the avoidance of doubt. In the human resources policies, the HR policies, ED&I is equality, diversity and inclusivity. H&S is health and safety policies. So you have health and safety, and RAMS is risk assessments and method statements that would be generally found in construction type organisations, but not solely limited to. I ran a stray dog kennels and had risk assessments and method statements in place. The General Data Protection Regulations is GDPR. And it's interesting around things like net zero and the carbon reduction policy that is really mounting in popularity, isn't it, now? But again, that proportionality is going to be key to some of those things. And so what we've said on this slide is that regardless of which business you are, you will probably need to be represented policy-wise in these areas as a minimum. So you will probably need some HR policies, some health and safety policies, some data protection stuff, and some social value or sustainability environmental type of policy. Are there other policies, Chris, that everyone might need, or are there any policies that you think would be relevant to specific sectors, just to give an indication to people who are on the call?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one that jumps out to me is around safeguarding. So, working in the NHS or in local government, safeguarding is really important. And what do we mean by safeguarding? It's how do we have procedures in place that protect those who are at risk of harm or abuse. And actually a lot of it, when you get into it, is stuff that we would probably all do anyway, as sort of good citizens and that sort of thing. But if we've got people working in and around the hospital, I'm sat in Lewisham Hospital right now, we'd want to make sure that they're taken into account safeguarding, and that it's safe for them to come and work on our site. So again, it's about proportionality. If you're providing care and support services, I'd expect your safeguarding policy to be very robust and detailed, and your staff will probably all have sort of dedicated safeguarding training. If you've come onto our site to do some mechanical engineering works, maybe to service a commercial boiler or something like that, you're still going to need a safeguarding policy, but it's going to look very different to someone who's providing services on site. So that safeguarding policy might just define what safeguarding is, designate a lead within your organisation, but that could be a manager or a supervisor or a safeguarding champion or something like that. And what staff would have to do if they see something that doesn't look right, or they think someone's at risk of harm. So it could be having a telephone number they have to call, either a local safeguarding team or something like that. And just making sure that people know what their responsibilities are. So that doesn't have to be war and peace, but it's something that's really important, especially in public sector contracts, when a lot of large public sector organisations are delivering services to vulnerable people, that safeguarding is a really key thing to sort of think about, and to think, right, if I saw something that didn't look right, I'd probably contact someone to make sure I was contacting the right people so that they could look into it or otherwise do something about it. We'll probably do that anyway, but maybe it's worth having it written down and making sure that everybody who's delivering, especially when they're on site, knows what they need to do in that situation, and that's how we can safeguard. It's in the name. Safeguard these people who are at risk. So I think that's a really important one, and it sometimes can seem a little bit scary, but hopefully that's helped in terms of proportionality. And one thing I would advise, if you think about drafting a safeguarding policy, is just go onto your local council's website. They'll have a safeguarding page, and they'll have definitions of safeguarding. They'll have all the various numbers of people you might have to call if you see something that concerns you, and that'll be a really good starter for 10 for what you might need to include in the policy.
So that's great. So there is a message of, I think, less is more sometimes. That proportionality means don't tie yourself in knots. So on safeguarding, if that isn't your core business, and you're absolutely right, if it is your core business, then you will have an infrastructure that reflects that it's your core business. But if you're going into a school to do, as you say, boiler maintenance, or something that actually you could do that anyway. You could do that in a corporate office, or you might be on a school tomorrow, or you might be in a hospital where there are people with vulnerabilities. It is actually just about capturing the basics, isn't it? So that everybody can be briefed in a way that they can retain that information. That's really good advice. Thank you, Chris. And I think it's good advice also in terms of where you can go for help. So of course, in the Go for Growth programme, in the self-service portal, there are some tools and tips, and we've got a slide on it about how to build policy. But actually it's really great advice to go to your local authority. You know, they're working with things like safeguarding policies, but also all manner of policy all of the time, and they are there to support their providers and even potential providers. So it's a good place to go, isn't it? Yeah, great advice. Thank you, Chris. So if we think about the role of the policy, so as you've said, Chris, policy should be a reflection of who you are and how you work. But there's often a misconception, I think, with small businesses around how policies are actually utilised in a competition. I think it's misunderstood sometimes that policies can be scored, and it will be clear in the evaluation criteria if a policy would be scored or not, but 9 times out of 10 that's not the case. They're not going to have a scored weighting. So if it isn't scored in competitions, would you just help us understand a little bit about why the public sector asked to see them in the first place, and what you do with them, and how often you check them, why they're important to you, that kind of thing?
I'll start off with the why they're important and why we asked them at all. So they form part of what we call sort of the selection process. So if we break up a procurement into selection and award, so the selection is us seeing, are you safe for us to work with? So if I use the safeguarding example, is it safe for me to let you on our site to deliver services around people that might be vulnerable? Or is it safe for you to hold on to some data because you've got the right data protection policies, and so on and so forth. So selection is all about, is it safe for you to operate? Is it safe for us to enter into a contract with you? And then the award criteria is more about how you're going to deliver that service or those supplies or those works. How are you going to do it? And does that constitute the best offer for us to accept? So the award stuff is what's scored. So that's your quality questions. That'll be how you're going to deliver. That's your pricing element. But the selection, which includes a lot of this policy stuff, is more, is it safe? Is it safe for us to go ahead with you? And when we're looking at that, we're comparing what you sent us to what our requirement is. So we're not comparing you with another organisation, and we're comparing you with what our requirement is to check if it's safe. And it's often a pass-fail type thing. So so that's why they're important and why we ask them at all. When do we look at them? What do we do with them? So the first time that we'll often ask for them is during the tender process. So during that procurement at the outset, to make sure that you're safe to work with. And then we might not look at them again for a while. We might look at them as part of an extension process or part of an annual review. Some contracts might look at them at every sort of quarterly meeting, but often it's a little bit less often than that. But what we do is we'll look at them when we think it's appropriate to do so. So again, it's not something we're looking at every single day. We've got lots of things to do, but it's about making sure that you've got that sort of underpinning that it's safe for us to work with you. And then we're checking them at an appropriate amount of time. Again, if you're delivering care and support services, that's going to get checked a lot more than if you're delivering paper. So it's about that, again, proportionality of how we manage it, as well as what would be in that policy.
Yeah, no, I think it does cover the question in terms of why you ask for them. I think there is a notion that you can have a policy for a bid and that's job done, and that isn't the case. As a provider, that policy, it is a reflection of how you work, so that policy needs to be organic and live, and you need to review it regularly. On the bottom point on the screen, communicating that policy is also really important, because in theory, whoever you ask in the organisation, whether that organisation is 10,000 strong or one person strong, everybody should know and understand what the policy environment is, and that takes some balancing. If you have 150 policies, no one's going to be able to retain that information in their head. And make sure they're accessible, but also communicate them really well. And I've talked about a toolbox talk, any changes. For those that aren't familiar with toolbox talk, it's a communication method. It's where actually you generally communicate face to face, but in small groups it can be done digitally. But effectively it's a Q&A session so that members of your team who really need to understand this policy have the ability to have it briefed and ask questions, and then really they can sign to say, yes, I get it, yes, I've had it, yes, I understand it. And that's a story that you can tell in a bid. So yes, you have the policy, but here is how we bring the policy to life. And you can do that in a way that makes sense to specification and questions throughout throughout the bid itself. Is it true then, Chris, next question from me, that if you're a winning bidder, that everything then becomes contractualised, and that includes the policies that you submitted in the selection process? And if that is true, what happens if given that they're fluid and organic and they should move with you as an organisation, what happens if they're changed quite substantially during a contract period? Are there any changes to a policy that could inadvertently become damaging to a provider?
That's a really good question. So in terms of them being contractualised, often that's the case. And even if they're not in as many words, because that's the basis of how, part of the basis of how we're making the decision, they sort of will form part of that anyway, in terms of if there's a material change, it might lead us to a point where we'd say, well, actually, if this was the case, we'd entered into contract, we wouldn't have entered into contract, and can lead to some less friendly approaches in terms of if there's been dramatic changes it could lead to termination or stuff like that. Why do we contractualize them then? Well, we contractualize them because, as I said, we look at them at the outset, we look at them at key points, but what we don't want to be doing is watching you like a hawk through 365 days a year to make sure that nothing's ever changed on any one of your policies that you've sent us. So by putting it into a contract, what we do is we sort of share that responsibility. So that means if you change your policy in a material way, you need to let us know that you've changed it, and we might provide some feedback to say, actually, that's not acceptable in this form, you'll have to go back and have a look at it again. And what do I mean by material change? So that's where we make sort of quite a drastic change. So if you're just tweaking it to say, we normally do our briefing on a Wednesday, and we've decided to do it every other Thursday, it's probably not going to constitute a material change if you're talking about toolbox talks or how often you disseminate that information across the organisation. If, however, in your data protection policy, you talk about how you secure personal data securely, perhaps within the UK, within a server farm or something like that, and then you decide you're going to outsource it, send it somewhere else that maybe doesn't have as robust data protection legislation, that could constitute a material change, and that could cause some big problems both for us and for yourselves. So just in terms of like that example, what could happen if it all went wrong? Well, if it all went wrong, that's when the Information Commissioner's Office gets involved. There could be fines around data protection breaches, and there also could be sort of elements of default on the contract because we'd agreed in the contract that data would be stored in a particular way, and then it was changed. So that's sort of, I know that's sort of a worst case scenario of what could happen, but it's some of the risk that's involved with sort of changing things quite dramatically. And one thing I'd ask, or one thing I'd recommend, is if you think you need to change something, maybe because it doesn't reflect what you do, or practice has evolved, or you're looking at making a bit of a change, check with your contract manager. You'll have a lead contact for that contract, a contact for that contract. So have a conversation with them at your next contract review meeting, or drop them an email and just maybe say, I'm thinking of updating this policy, summarize some of what the changes are, and they'll give you some feedback then. Quite often, contract managers and procurement teams are quite happy to provide some advice or to respond to queries like that, because we're actually really grateful that you'd contact us and sort of keep us involved and keep us in the loop. So yeah, so essentially it's trying to avoid the situation where you'll submit a fantastic policy and then rip it up 3 days later and do something totally different. So if that seems a bit doom and gloom and a bit scary, I do apologise. That wasn't the intention, but it's sort of to sort of show that balance of risk that's involved in it, and so much of what we're doing in the public sector when we're dealing with our communities and working with potentially really vulnerable people or children, that it's about how we balance that risk and how we can make sure we're doing things as safely and securely as possible.
Now, I think it's a really important point, and on the balance of probability, the likelihood of things going wrong actually is really small. However, I think it's a good diligence for a small business owner. If you're thinking of changing something in a policy that you submitted into a bid in the middle of a contract period, there are two things, aren't there? So definitely have a chat with your contract manager who can advise. Actually, materiality is difficult to quantify what is material and what isn't, and what is actually just a reflection of your changes in your business. But you can also, so chat to your contract manager, you can think around, actually, if I make this change and God forbid in the really unlucky situation that something did go wrong and we had to rely on this policy as part of our ability to show our defence, would the change make that harder or not? And have a think about that. But your contract manager, that relationship is there to help. So that should be a really open relationship with your contract manager. I think it's a great shout, Chris. Final question on this actually. So when do people need to have policies in place? Do they need to always have policies in place when they're bidding?
The policies that we showed on the slide before, we would assume you probably have some version of that most of the time. But there might be policies that we ask for that are relevant to a particular contract or a particular organisation that you might not need the rest of the time, or you might only need it to service this contract. So one thing I'd advise people to do is, if you're not sure, you haven't seen this policy before, or you'd only be writing it for this, ask the buying organisation for a copy of their policy. I think that's really important. It can give you an idea of what sort of level of detail that they're looking for and what it actually covers. And also you can ask the question to see if you can sort of self-certify to say, I'll have a policy in place if I need one after the tender before the contract starts, and see if that's acceptable. Most of the time that's fine. What we'll do is we'll make sure we get it at some point in that evaluation process, but it means you don't have to do it at the same time as writing all of your quality answers and putting your pricing together in what can sometimes be quite a tight turnaround. So it doesn't mean you can just put it off forever, but sometimes that's a really appropriate way around of doing it, of sort of maybe seeing if you get through the first round, if it's a multi-stage procurement, and then drafting it at that stage. So yeah, you don't always need it up front. Some of them we hope you'd have anyway, especially around sort of health and safety and some of the sort of more generic sort of HR policies and data protection. But we do acknowledge that sometimes we'll ask for something that's a little bit out of left field, or just in relation to a particular contract or a particular need. But yeah, I'd recommend talking to the buying organisation. So every electronic tender portal I've used has got some sort of clarification process. So that's normally a really secure way of making sure the message goes to the right person. So what will happen is that will often come into the procurement team, and then they'll make sure that the right person within the organisation answers that question. And those clarifications are really important because there's always a record of them. So they're good from our point of view in the sense that they're auditable, but from your side, it means that they're always getting looked at. They'll notify anybody that's sort of attached to that project. So if I'm on holiday or off sick, it doesn't just sit in my inbox. Someone else will deal with it. So yeah, that's hopefully it's more holidays than getting sick. But
yeah, and often clarification questions can be a scary phenomena for small businesses. You feel like you probably shouldn't be asking, you should know the answer to that question. I can't say enough, both as a small business and a procurer, use them. They are there to be used. There is no such thing. The only silly question is the one you wanted to ask but you didn't. Everything else is absolutely on the table. You can bet your life that there are other businesses who are struggling with exactly the same thing. And of course, in clarification questions, it's rare that the answer wouldn't be public. If you ask a question, the answer will go to all bidders, which is really useful. To try and go on, sorry, Chris.
Clarification point. Sometimes we're not perfect either. So sometimes you'll ask a clarification question saying, I don't think that makes sense. And we'll go, yeah, you're right, that doesn't make sense. We need to change it, or this bit contradicts with that bit, and we'll issue an amendment, or we'll do something like that. So sometimes asking the question is really helpful, not just from your side, but it also can help us. Because while we like to think we get everything right all the time, we know that that's unrealistic, and sometimes there'll be an element where we go, oh, how do we miss that? And so clarification questions are really useful. And sometimes you look at it and you go, am I going mad not seeing that? Why does that make any sense? Ask the question. I can't say that anymore.
No, it's a really important process, and businesses should feel really super comfortable using it. In terms of just some helpful tips, my colleague Andrew Chamberlain from Consort Strategy has put together just a real simple one-page guide of things that you should think about in terms of structure and sources of information for a policy. And there's also a 20-minute video tutorial by Andrew in terms of how to actually pull a policy together. So we're not going to watch the video today, but it will be included in the slide deck, and it's also in the Go for Growth programme if anybody should want it. We're going to talk a little bit about templates, and you've given us some great advice so far, Chris, in terms of what should a bidder do if they don't have the policy that a public sector buying organisation has asked for. You can, ask them for a copy of theirs, etc. I think businesses worry that if they don't have a policy, it would count them out. So it's great to hear from you that actually you don't necessarily need everything for the bid point. There is that element of self-certification to say, actually, we will have it by the time, subject to us to being successful, by the time that the contract commences. Lots of businesses do tell us that if there's too much policy development work that needs doing, that could be a walk away point for them in a bid, in terms of actually there's just too much work to get us over the line. And so templates actually can be really quite helpful to manage the workload that can be associated with policy. Do you, in your professional opinion, do you think there are any health warnings with using templates? Is there ever a time when a template shouldn't be used, or are they always a good go-to, do you think?
My opinion is, I think templates are a really useful tool, but I think that they're not a quick fix, and they're not the be-all and end-all. So by all means, use a template to help with structure, to maybe prompt at what sorts of things you need to think about. But really interrogate that to check that it fits your organisation, because sometimes it will have a fairly generic process or procedure in place. And if you look at it and go, we don't do it like that, then it's probably not the right detail for you. And maybe you can tweak it, maybe you can amend it, or maybe just use that as a framework to write your own policy. So I think that templates have definitely got a really important part to play in developing sort of your policy framework as an organisation, but I just sort of caution on relying on them too much, because I think what will happen there is you'll end up with policies that don't reflect your organisation, don't describe what you do, and then if you're ever relying on them in the future, they're not really worth the paper they're written on, because they won't help you, because it doesn't cover what you do. So use them as a tool, as an enabling tool, but don't rely on them too much, and make sure that you're reading them carefully and making any changes to make it suitable for you and your organisation. So hopefully that's a balanced view on them. I completely think they've got a really important part to play, but just a bit of caution there as well.
And I guess it's not necessarily just a blanket internet search using a search engine. You can get that so that your template is almost as nuanced as it can be. So if you're a member of the Federation of Small Businesses, for example, and you're a small business, or if you are providing a vendor management services and you're a voluntary sector organisation, you might be a member of Clinks, for example. If you're a member of a membership organisation, they're likely to have templates that have been developed with your type of business in mind. And so they are less general and more specialist, but still need reflecting in terms of, what you do and who you are. The ACAS are the Advice and Conciliatory If you're in trouble, they help you mediate. But they have lots of HR templates. So if you're looking for a disciplinary template or a grievance template or an absence management template, they are really good places to start. And as Chris has mentioned before, talk to contracting authorities, the one that you're bidding with, or you can talk to your local authority of where you're based. And actually, if you've got things like in your health and safety policy that you would have the Contractors Health and Safety Scheme accreditation, the CHAS accreditation, actually some of those things have annualised certification on them. And so they reflect in your policy the currency of your information, which can be really quite useful and powerful when you're looking to secure work. And as a small business, I started out with 2 members of staff in my kennels. We grew to 10. And actually what that meant to us was that we needed to have a much more robust human resources policy environment. But we weren't policy experts, and we definitely weren't HR policy experts. So we actually worked with a retainer organisation. And for what wasn't a huge amount of money, we shifted the burden of understanding what the current legislation meant we needed to do and how to translate that into our business. So sometimes, depending on your size or complexity of your organisation and the risk that you're working with on a day-to-day basis, it can be sometimes a good thing to use a retainer organisation to help you with those things. There's usually them in HR, health and safety, and there's lots in data now these days also. And if you are thinking about safeguarding that Chris talked about, I've used the NSPCC templates before because they are built around safeguarding children, and that's what I really needed my policy to talk about and help me with, and then I could just nuance that into what my business was about. So there are, as Chris says, there are lots of great templates out there. They're not going to be a silver bullet because they will always be reflective of an organisation that isn't yours. So just make sure they do reflect who you are and where you are.
Be really careful when you search for templates that I try to look for them from UK organisations, because sort of our legislative framework and background is slightly different to, I know a lot of the resources out there are based in the US. Well, they've got a totally different sort of legal framework underpinning it, so it might be sort of for want of a better term, compliant with a different sort of framework of regulations and legislation than what we have to work with and work within. So that's generally a sort of a helpful rule of thumb as well.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you, Chris.